Something historic just happened in Canada, and Washington didn't see it coming. Two men who have spent years on opposite sides of politics suddenly stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, as if drawn together by something bigger than party lines. Mark Carney, Canada's sharp-minded prime minister known for his quiet precision, and Doug Ford, the blunt, working-class premier of Ontario, stood united under one message. Canada will no longer be dictated to by Washington. This wasn't some photo op or polite handshake for the cameras. This was power, raw, deliberate, and loud enough to echo across the border. It sent shockwaves through every trade office in DC and every auto boardroom in Detroit. Because for the first time in years, Canada wasn't asking for permission. It was setting the tone. Trump's America has been tightening the screws on Canada, tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, even auto parts. Threats against the Canadian economy have become the new normal. But today, Carney and Ford flipped the script. Their announcement wasn't just about a project or budget. It was about a national awakening, the day Canada decided to take control of its own destiny. And as the cameras rolled inside Darlington Nuclear Station, you could feel it. A new era had just begun. The air at the Darlington Nuclear Generating Station felt heavier than usual. Cameras were rolling, lights glaring, and somewhere in the background, the low hum of the turbines matched the buzz running through every Canadian watching live. Then it happened. Mark Carney and Doug Ford walked in together, not shaking hands for optics, not smiling for headlines, standing shoulder to shoulder with the quiet tension of two men who knew the country was watching. Carney, calm, analytical, the economist-turned-prime minister, took the mic first. His voice wasn't fiery, it was surgical. "What we're living through isn't a transition," he said slowly. "It's a rupture, a clean break from the old order." In that sentence, every journalist in the room understood. This wasn't politics as usual. It was an announcement of independence. For years, Canada's economy had revolved around the United States, trade, energy, manufacturing, even diplomacy. But as Washington tightened its grip through tariffs and threats, Canada's patience snapped. Today was the answer. Ford, normally the populist outsider, stood beside Carney like a general beside a strategist. He didn't interrupt. He didn't grandstand. He simply nodded as if saying, "Finally." The symbolism was electric, a liberal-leaning technocrat and a conservative powerhouse, united under one flag instead of two parties. And behind them, that humming power plant embodied everything they stood for. Canadian energy, built by Canadian workers, fueling both sides of the border. This wasn't a photo op. It was a turning point, the moment Canada realized it didn't need to ask anyone for permission to protect its future. The unity looked almost impossible on paper, yet there it was, captured in a single frame. And as the crowd leaned forward, one question hung in the air. What had pushed these two men to join forces now? By the time Carney and Ford stepped onto that stage, the pressure from Washington had already reached a breaking point. For months, Trump's administration had been turning trade into a weapon, hammering Canada with tariffs, quotas, and threats that seemed designed not to negotiate, but to humiliate. Lumber, steel, aluminum, autos, nothing was safe. Every new tariff was another shove, another reminder that America still thought it could pull Canada's strings. Then came the moment that broke the silence. Trump's Commerce Secretary hinted that American manufacturing should move south, a not-so-subtle threat aimed directly at Ontario's auto workers, the very backbone of the province's economy. To Ford, it was a personal insult. To Carney, it was economic blackmail. The U.S. was trying to choke Canada's industry until it submitted. But this time, Ottawa didn't fold. Behind closed doors, Carney and Ford reached the same conclusion: enough was enough. They weren't going to let another administration treat Canadian workers like disposable labor. The night before the announcement, Ford told advisors, "If Trump wants a fight, he'll get one. But it won't be fought with words, it'll be fought with action." Carney agreed, but his version of a fight was different. It wasn't a brawl, it was a plan. A strategy that would cut off Washington's leverage entirely. The two men weren't just responding to Trump's tariffs, they were about to rewrite the rules of North American trade. And as the cameras flashed at Darlington, every viewer could sense it. This wasn't just defiance. It was declaration. Canada had been patient for decades, cooperative for generations. But now, after years of watching its industries threatened and its economy bullied, Canada was finally ready to push back. When Doug Ford took the microphone, the tone of the entire event changed. The polished calm of Carney's delivery gave way to something raw, direct, and unmistakably Canadian. Ford didn't read from a teleprompter. He didn't quote data. He spoke from the gut, the voice of every worker, every trucker, every family watching their livelihoods squeezed by Trump's tariffs. "You can't bully the hand that keeps your country running," he said, his words slicing through the silence. It wasn't a line for applause, but the crowd roared anyway. Because in that moment, Ford wasn't speaking as Ontario's premier. He was speaking as a Canadian patriot. He reminded everyone that Canada isn't a junior partner or a charity case, it's an energy superpower. Every day, oil from Alberta, power from Ontario, and gas from Newfoundland flow south, keeping American cities alive. We keep the lights on in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, Ford said, but we'll never dim our own just to keep theirs shining. That line spread like wildfire across social media, clips, quotes, headlines. Ford's blunt message wasn't polished diplomacy. It was defiance. It was the first time in years a Canadian leader had publicly stared down Washington's arrogance and refused to blink. Even Carney, usually unshakable, cracked a small smile beside him. Ford had said what the rest of Canada was thinking but never dared to say aloud. And behind that tough talk was a larger strategy that only Carney could execute. Building the economic backbone that would make those words real. Because Ford's fire lit the spark, but Carney's plan would turn it into power. And what Carney revealed next would make even Washington take notice. When Mark Carney finally stepped back to the podium, the noise of applause faded into silence. His tone was calm, but his words carried the weight of a national blueprint. This wasn't just a speech, it was a declaration of intent. Carney unveiled what he called the One Canadian Economy Act, a sweeping plan designed to unite every province under one economic strategy. It would link Canada through infrastructure, energy, and innovation, rail lines from coast to coast, smart grids powering cities, and homegrown industries built to last. This is not about isolation, Carney said firmly, it's about independence. He explained that for too long, Canada had relied on foreign approval, especially from the United States, to define success, but those days were over. We're going to do more with less, he said. We'll eliminate waste, cut red tape, and invest directly in Canadians, not in Washington's approval. Carney's vision was simple but revolutionary. Instead of exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods, Canada would build the full supply chain at home. The nation's pension funds, banks, and investors would fuel domestic projects, not foreign ones. Every dollar invested would circulate inside the Canadian economy, multiplying its power. But beneath the economics was something deeper: pride. A belief that Canada could thrive not by competing for attention, but by building self-reliance. Carney wasn't shouting, he didn't need to, the plan itself spoke volumes. In that quiet, deliberate tone, he dismantled decades of dependency and replaced it with strategy. It was clear, Canada was done reacting to America's moves. From now on, Ottawa would move first, and Washington would have to follow. And the next part of his message would turn this plan into something even bigger, a revolution in thinking. What Carney had just outlined wasn't merely a policy shift, it was a revolution in mindset. For decades, Canada had played the role of the cooperative neighbor, always adjusting its plans to fit Washington's agenda. But as Carney spoke, that image shattered. This wasn't about asking for permission anymore, it was about setting the standard. He called it a rupture, not a transition, a sudden, irreversible break from dependency. Canada, he said, had relied too long on American demand, American investors, and American validation. That old system had made the country comfortable but also vulnerable. Every tariff, every trade threat, every offhand remark from Washington had become a reminder that comfort came with a leash. Carney's solution was to cut it permanently. He described a Canada that would design its own technologies, finance its own industries, and power its own future. Not isolationist but independent, not anti-American but unapologetically Canadian. He reminded the audience that Canada wasn't weak, it was wealthy in every way that mattered. From rare minerals to nuclear energy, from AI to clean manufacturing, Canada already held the cards. All it needed was the will to play them. And that's when the mood in the room began to change. You could feel it, a collective realization that this wasn't just another policy announcement. It was a mental reset. Carney's message was clear. The real war wasn't between Canada and America. It was between Canada's old self-doubt and its new confidence. And when Ford stepped forward again, it was clear he understood exactly what Carney was building, because the next chapter of this story would show what happens when rivals become builders of a new nation. When Doug Ford took the stage again, the air inside Darlington shifted from political to personal. The premier who once built his image on defiance was now standing shoulder to shoulder with a prime minister he used to criticize. And instead of sparks, there was solidarity. "I don't give two hoots what color stripe anyone comes from," Ford said, glancing at Carney. "If you're ready to build this country, you're my ally." The crowd broke into applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that said, "We've waited a long time for this." In that instant, party lines blurred. Ford's populist grit met Carney's global strategy, and together they created something that felt bigger than politics, a blueprint for a united Canada. Two leaders who once represented opposite ends of the spectrum were now fighting the same fight, defending Canadian workers, industries, and independence from outside pressure. Ford spoke about building from the ground up, while Carney nodded, calling it future-proofing the nation. Their words meshed like gears in motion, different in tone, identical in purpose. It was the same message dressed in two languages. Strength and structure. It reminded people of the past, when Canadian leaders put rivalry aside to build railways, hydro dams, and the very infrastructure that shaped the nation. But this time, the project wasn't physical. It was economic, philosophical, emotional. For once, Canadians watching from coast to coast weren't seeing politicians argue. They were watching two builders lay the foundation for a new era of unity, one built on trust, not party loyalty. And as cameras zoomed in on Carney's nod of approval, it became clear that this alliance wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. Because the next step wasn't talk, it was the blueprint for a new Canada. By the time Carney outlined the details, every camera in the room was locked on him. This wasn't theory anymore, it was a plan. The first major project under the One Canadian Economy Act would unite provinces the way the railroads once did, but with 21st-century tools. Clean energy grids, advanced rail corridors, and digital infrastructure designed to make Canada self-reliant from coast to coast. The project's aim was simple but historic: to build a nation where no foreign power could ever pull the plug on Canadian progress. Instead of waiting for American supply chains or global investors, Carney wanted Canadian capital, pension funds, provincial surpluses, and private sector strength reinvested directly into Canadian hands. He spoke of crowding in investment, a term economists use for multiplying domestic growth. Translation: every dollar spent in Canada would create more jobs, more factories, and more innovation, all without begging for Washington's approval. Ford called it building muscle where we've been leaning for too long. Carney nodded, adding that this wasn't just economic, it was moral. A nation that produces its own power, builds its own tech, and trades on its own terms can't be bullied by tariffs or tweets. And then came the line that sealed it. Canada has more than enough firepower, Carney said, to give ourselves far more than the Americans are taking away. Silence filled the room. Not the uneasy kind, but the kind that follows realization. Everyone knew they had just witnessed a turning point, because what Carney and Ford had drawn wasn't just policy. It was a blueprint for sovereignty, one that could rewrite the economic map of North America. As the press conference came to an end, there was a rare silence, the kind that follows a moment of history. Reporters didn't rush the stage. Cameras didn't click wildly. Everyone just stood there, realizing they had witnessed something that went beyond politics or policy. Mark Carney and Doug Ford had just done what no one thought possible: unite Canada's left and right, business and labor, east and west, under one simple idea: self-reliance. This wasn't about nuclear plants or trade charts. It was about a country reclaiming its backbone. A Canada that no longer flinches when Washington threatens tariffs. A Canada that doesn't wait for permission to lead. Carney's tone was calm but final: no tariff, no threat. No president will decide Canada's future again. And beside him, Ford's grin said it all: this was the new normal. Two very different men, one shared mission: build a Canada that no one can push around. For years, critics mocked Canada as the polite neighbor, the country that compromises, that yields, that apologizes for wanting more. But today, that story changed. Today, the world saw a nation that stands tall, unapologetic, and ready to fight for its future. And across Canada, from St. John's to Vancouver, people watching live felt it, that quiet surge of pride, that rare sense of unity that can't be faked. Because this wasn't a speech, it was a shift. A declaration that Canada is done playing second fiddle. The world is changing, and this time Canada isn't following, it's leading. This is Northern Pulse, where Canada's rise is told loud, clear, and unstoppable. Canada.